To host this conversation and introduce our guest, I'm happy to pass you over to Carol Ann Germain. She's Associate Teaching Professor, Co-Director of the Informatics PhD program, and Chair of the Information Sciences and Technology Department in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity. Together with other fearless, adventurous, superhero librarians here at UAlbany, she is a pioneer in the field of information literacy, which attempts to teach and encourage the crucial responsibility of assessing the credibility, accuracy, relevance, and bias of information sources. Please welcome Dr. Carol Ann Germain and Nathan Grayson.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here this afternoon. We're delighted to have Nathan with us. And so Nathan is a journalist specializing in video games, live streaming, and digital culture. He has worked at the Washington Post, where he covered these subjects extensively. He has also contributed to Rock, Paper, Shotgun, which highlights PC gaming and their philosophy in that AAAs and indies are just as likely to produce fascinating games worthy of our time and coverage and give all extremes equal prominence. He is known for his in-depth reporting on the work cultures and politics of companies like Blizzard and Google. Currently, he is the co-founder and reporter at Aftermath, which is a worker-owned, reader-supported, important part, site covering video games, the internet, and the cultures that surround them. And certainly, he's just put February 18th, his first book, which is really impressive. And so we are going to talk about that this afternoon. I have about 40 minutes worth of questions, but you think about some questions that you'd like to ask too. He's fascinating, and the book, I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to start. You are a writer in a very different vein. Like rock stars of Twitch, you are one of a very few famous video game journalists.
I wouldn't go that far. Wouldn't go anywhere near that far, but that's fine.
What called you to become a writer, and more specifically, a writer in this niche area?
Honestly, it's just that like I grew up playing video games. I knew that I liked them. I didn't think that I wanted to make them. Like my dad ran a company that made games, and I was always like, I don't know if that's for me. But I knew that I wanted to do something involving them. And at the time, like, you know, I grew up reading video game magazines, which are barely a thing anymore. Websites are barely a thing anymore. What a time to be alive. But I was like, well, maybe I can do that. And so I just started like posting on forums and stuff like that. And people liked my writing enough that that eventually became, you know, freelance writing opportunities and things of that nature. And so by the time that I graduated from college, I was making enough freelance money that I could just, you know, do that as my job, which again, this is not a career path that exists anymore. It's just totally gone. But that led me to writing about video games. And then over time, I went from being like, I want to review and criticize games to, well, you know, this is this massive medium that's worth billions and has all of these businesses and all of these different cultures under its umbrella. And like those deserve to be covered in a serious way, in a serious journalistic way. And that's where I ended up.
Your book, Stream Big, in the back,
And Grant.
is noted on your LinkedIn page with a start date of 2009, though your book says 2020. So we're not going to quibble there. Mm-hmm. Obviously not generated with ChatGPT. Can you provide some insight into your writing over those 5 to 6 years and the process?
Oh, man. So, yeah, I originally got the book deal in 2019, or the tail end of it. And my goal with this book was always to talk to the main streamers featured in person and like really interview them and like talk to them for a long time in person, basically, because I think that with Twitch, especially because you're watching people, you know, for many hours per day in some cases, like full-time streamers, you know, will do it for 8 to 10. Even smaller streamers will stream for at least a few hours per day. It's easy to get this impression that you know them because you've seen so much of their life play out in front of you and that you've, you know, seen it all. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And so I wanted to like actually go behind the scenes, actually see them like in their homes or at events or wherever else, dealing with like all the mundane kind of like Can I curse? Okay, cool. All the mundane bullshit that goes into like, creating a live stream, which on its face appears to be just one person sitting in front of a camera, but is often the streamer, their moderators, video editors for stuff like YouTube, in some cases employees if they're big enough, like this whole kind of like an entire ecosystem of people basically. And so I wanted to be able to see that so that I could more accurately describe it. And so I pitched all of this, got the book deal, and then it was 2020 and no one could go anywhere and I couldn't talk to anyone in person. And that kind of sucked. So I just had to like sort of sit on the book for a year and a half, basically. And so I wasn't able to actually do any reporting or writing or interviewing or any of that until like mid 2021. And even then, like people were still sort of iffy on in-person meetups. And so, yeah, I didn't really like start writing it or researching it until like 2022, 2023. That's when it like all happened. And then, yeah, like I said, it was a matter of going to people's houses and places of work and interviewing them where they were at, which in a lot of cases was not super easy because there was sort of this arc from when I first got the book deal of a lot of these streamers being smaller and not necessarily having found their audiences yet, to some of them becoming massively famous during those intervening years because Twitch also blew up in 2020. And so I was like, hey, remember me? Do you still want to talk to me? And some of them were like, oh, yeah, sure. And others were like, just silence. In one case, actually, I can go into the weeds of this. So Hassan Piker, who probably a lot of you have heard of, is in the book. One of the chapters is about him. And to get that interview, to go to his house, it was entirely happenstance. I was in town to cover another event, and like I had been trying to talk with his manager and like get in touch with him that way. He wasn't replying. I was like, well, great, I'm gonna have to cut him from the book. That's really depressing. But I was at this event and I saw him walk into the bathroom, and I was like, all right, it's now or never. And so I just walked up to Hassan and was like, hey, can I come to your home and interview you like later this week? And he's like, sure, yeah. And it worked.
Very cool. So I assume you did all of your interviews in person. Is that something you feel most comfortable about?
So the big interviews are in person, right? The ones that like kind of are the backbone of each chapter, and then like all of the, I guess, additional like color that's provided by smaller streamers and by like people in the industry, that was more negotiable on that front. But yeah, I mean, like I think that that part really yielded some interesting conversations, if only because I think that a lot of streamers and a lot of content creators are not necessarily used to talking outside the bounds of the content that they make. Like, they're used to talking to a camera, they're used to making videos, they're used to doing streams, but they're not used to being like rigorously interrogated about what they do. And they're also not used to answering questions about like how they feel about it and their emotional state. And so another interesting byproduct of all of this is that I came away from like half the interviews thinking, you really need therapy. I am not a professional therapist. You just told me a lot of stuff that you should have told somebody who's actually like knows how to do this.
Sure, they were grateful to you.
Yeah. And now it's in a book. Sorry.
That's what you get. Over the last decade plus, you have been quite outspoken in your writing about DEI and sexualization in video gaming. In your selection of interviewees for the book, you certainly took this into account. With the current political climate, do you see some of the progress in that area slipping?
I mean, obviously. If we're talking about like DEI in particular, I think that that's a fraught subject, if only because broadly speaking, DEI was a series of initiatives enacted by companies to make themselves look good. I'm not sure that it necessarily succeeded in terms of, I guess, helping marginalized people gain actual power within organizations. So I think it was more of like a straw man for, the right to attack. But we're definitely seeing a lot of companies and organizations now say, okay, well, we never really cared about diversity. We never really cared about like queer people or any of that. It was all just, us going along with what felt like it was right at the time. And we're going to roll all of that back. We're going to take money out of that, so on and so forth. So to answer your question, yeah.
Yeah. So throughout your book, one of the things that kept surfacing for me was even though it wasn't, but was Twitch at the start with a lot of the technologies we have was a kind of a grassroots kind of application. And specifically the idea that it's got a community. And that has changed since Amazon certainly took over the application. What advice would you give to new streamers looking to build a strong community, whether it's on Twitch or another landscape?
Yeah, I mean, if you're starting out on Twitch, then the advice is go to places that aren't Twitch. Like promote all your content on TikTok. That's how you do it. That's how you get an audience now. And even then, it's not surefire. But like Twitch is big and saturated enough that if you try to just stream, like if you say, okay, I'm going to stream for 2 hours per day, you'll start out with 0 people and you'll end up with 1 to 3 people. Like you can't build an audience that way. You have to diversify your content across every platform. You've got to take all of your Twitch streams, cut them up into videos that you publish to YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, pretty much anywhere else. But also, like, that's really hard because that's tons of additional work. And if you just got into it because you like streaming, then you're suddenly doing all of this other stuff that you didn't really want to do, which is not ideal. But I think that in the moment, Twitch is not really looking to create a solution to that problem. So it's kind of your only option.
Obviously, from your work on the book and at different news outlets, you follow some of the traditional reporter techniques, strategies. Certainly, you can, reading your interviews, you can see that. Can you discuss those with our audience members who might want to follow in your career footsteps?
Like what kind of like techniques do you mean? Like just, research and reporting and stuff like that? Yeah, let's see. Okay. If somebody wants to be a journalist, step 1 in this day and age, don't. Like it's a really hard field to get into. All the jobs are drying up. All the organizations are laying people off or closing. I need to preface it with that because yeah, it's like a really fraught time. Honestly, like a lot of what I found interesting, actually, to tangent a little bit, is that a lot of content creators are now sort of doing what essentially amounts to journalism, albeit with like, less traditional backing, without an organization behind them. If you look at like CoffeeZilla, if any of you are familiar with him, he like he digs into a lot of scams and things like that, and like reports them out very rigorously. Like there are more and more creators sort of doing things that are adjacent to journalism. But again, like that puts them in this hot water of, okay, what happens if you go after a company and they sue you? Which again, to use the CoffeeZilla example, happened to him. If you're at a major journalistic organization, they have lawyers. And so their lawyers will look over your piece before you publish it to make sure that it's legally airtight. And then they will also defend you if you get sued. If you're just one YouTuber or one streamer or whatever, you don't have that. And so you might end up in the situation where you're suddenly having to figure out how to defend yourself against a company that probably has way more money than you, just because like you told the truth, which is a really terrible state for things to be in. To answer your original question, I mean, I don't know, journalism is a lot of like little pieces of things put together. The best way that I can describe it is like, do you, as current students, really like doing homework? Because what if I told you there's a job where you can do homework for the rest of your life? In fact, that's pretty much all you do. That's journalism, is a lot of research, a lot of reading, tons of talking to people, and then trying to collate all of that into something that makes sense to a general audience. You won't always succeed, but if you do it right, it feels pretty good.
And I don't have this down as a question, but I want to follow up on that is it sounds like you're always reinventing yourself. How do you continue to do that? And how would these guys continue to do that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the real answer to that question is just like stay curious. I think that most people are naturally very curious, which is one of the better things about human beings as a species. But I think that living in society, it's very easy to have that kind of beat out of you because there's just so much to do constantly, and there's so many things to look at. You've got to work, and you've got to, put food on the table. You've got to do all this stuff, and it's exhausting. But the key to journalism, and to broaden that a little bit and sound like a real asshole, life, is to just constantly be like, hey, instead of looking at these people who are doing a thing that I don't understand and thinking, wow, they're terrible, or wow, I'm afraid of them, thinking, that's really interesting. And also, I bet that they're probably more like me than they are different from me. And so I want to understand why they're doing that, even if I'm not doing that. Because if I was in their shoes, I probably would be. And so, like, what's going on there? Like, that's my driving question for pretty much every piece that I do, is like, those people are doing something different that I don't understand. I want to understand it.
So your book and in other written venues, you highlight the abuse of female content creators, some with stalkers, assaults. You had one just within the last few days.
Yep. Yeah, that was this week's big news story was multiple streamers getting stalked and assaulted, which again, what a time to be alive.
This should not be the norm. Why do you think this occurs more frequently in this area than in other internet and streaming platforms?
Yeah, I mean the really basic answer to this question is just that streamers are constantly live, and as a result, it's much easier to figure out where they are. You know, people on the internet have gotten very good at this in some cases. Places like Kiwi Farms, which is a notorious sort of swatting and doxing forum. People on the internet will tell you that no, that's not their main purpose. But when a lot of the results coming out of what they do lead to that, it's sort of hard to say that they don't at least play a role. Anyway, yeah, what that means though is that like if someone really wants to find you, they don't necessarily need your address and all of that. They can look at the background of where you are and then like, you know, match that with other information they have about a particular location. And then, you know, either physically stalk you or stalk you by suggesting they know your location or all of these other things. That's the basic one. And then the other part is that streaming, especially, I think, leads to a lot of parasocial relationships, which are relationships where one person on one side of the screen looks at the person who's streaming or creating content and says, you know, I really come to feel close to this person. I think that they are my friend, basically, in my mind, even if they don't state it on those terms. That's what their brain is doing. And so that person comes to mean a lot to them. And unfortunately, that creates a very thin line where somebody can just adore you. Or like if you're not doing what they want anymore, they can come to really hate you and feel justified in that hatred. And because we live in a pretty, I would say, sick society, some people then take that as incentive to go find someone and potentially harm them or at least stalk them. You know, there have been instances of both in the world of live streaming. There have been people who have really liked a creator and have like flown across the world to see them, like from other countries, shown up and been like, "Hey, I'm here. You know, I'm so and so from chat." And then of course, creators like, "What are you doing? Like, get back on the airplane." But yeah, and then this week there was the opposite of that, where three major streamers were out on Santa Monica Pier, and somebody basically approached them, probably having seen where they were on stream, and first like did some antics. He was like, "Will you listen to my song?" And they're like, "I guess so." And then he didn't really sing a song. He just sort of said some stuff. And then he was like, "Will you give me your number?" to one of them. They were all women, by the way, of course. And they're like, "No, that's weird," and tried to walk away. He followed them. And then after a while of being told to stay away, just like bum rushed them and tried to attack them while saying he was going to kill them. So yeah, not good.
Not crazy. I'm going to get back into your parasocial because that really fascinated me. I didn't know that much about it until reading it. How do you see the future of parasocial relationships evolving as technology and streaming platforms continue to develop and go in their way?
I mean, I think that they will always be a component of all of this because, again, we just like, you know, our very relatively simple human brains evolved to like perceive other people and form bonds with them. And so if you're spending all of what your brain perceives to be as time with someone every day, you're going to feel an attachment. That's just like kind of impossible to avoid. I think that where this goes is less a technology thing and more of a culture thing. I think that especially in early days, like people just didn't know what to do with this. Whereas now, if you see like, you'll see audiences of pretty much every major streamer talking about parasocial relationships and either often cautioning against them, being like, "Oh, that person got too parasocial. That's weird. Don't do that." Some streamers like Dream, who's in my book, have kind of like encouraged people to get weirdly parasocial, and that's not great. But most streamers and content creators, YouTubers, whatever, look at that and say, "No, that's a bad example. You don't want to be doing that." And I think that even Dream, over the course of the events of this chapter, kind of learned his lesson on that front. Because there was all this controversy around him, allegations of grooming and things like that, because he'd been DMing people. And like, yeah, it comes back to bite you. You can't, like, creators, especially big ones, have a responsibility to their audience. If you have 30 million followers or something and you're DMing some rando who has none, you have immense power over them. And at that point, like you just shouldn't be engaging like your friends. You shouldn't be creating that illusion. You should be saying, hey, just so you know, like I am functionally an authority figure in your life, and you should not be treating me like we're best friends because I can't be that for you.
So you've got a lot in the book. Were there any surprises other than everyone needing a psychologist?
Let's see. There were multiple surprises. So, like, one of the things about reporting on this book is, again, I did it over a fairly long period of time. And streaming, especially, is like this very volatile medium. There are new things happening every day. There's a new drama of the week every week, sometimes every day. You know, weeks happen within days, years happen within months. I don't know. Anyway, and so yeah, there were a couple instances where I thought that I had the basic outline of a chapter. I thought that I had a basic idea of where it was going to go because I'd interviewed somebody, you know, traveled back home. It's like, okay, here's what it's going to be. And then like a seismic event happened like a week later. The Amaranth chapter in particular. So, you know, she's a Twitch streamer slash now Kick streamer, does a lot of content that sort of I would say like within or maybe a little bit outside the realm of sex work. And so I had interviewed her at this like office that she owned for an agency that she had that worked with like OnlyFans models basically. And like had talked to her for like a day about her business and her approach to everything because she's really unique in this regard. She like invests money in all of these other industries. She owns gas stations. She owns an orchard now, which is a wild thing for a live streamer to own. And I was like, cool, that's really interesting. This is going to be a great chapter. And then like 2 weeks later, she went live with allegations that her husband, who people had like, there had been rumors she had one, but she had always denied them, but that her husband was abusing her and had like financial control over her and was using that to get her to do things that she didn't want to do in terms of the content she was making and all of this terrible stuff. They had a big fight over the phone that was broadcast on the stream. It was really, really gnarly. And so I was like, well, everything that I thought I knew about this person kind of goes out the window, which to me was especially interesting in that, again, I thought that by like interviewing people in person and like going behind the scenes, I'd be able to get a full picture of what was happening in their lives. But in this case, I was wrong. And the fuller picture came out over a stream, which sort of disproved my whole hypothesis, or at least suggested that at least in the cases of some of these creators, like they are always kind of donning a mask or like putting on a show, whether they are talking to you in person or over the internet. And that mask rarely slips. But if someone's on camera for long enough and like streaming all the time, which in Amaranth's case, at that point, she was streaming like 13 or 14 hours per day. She was like overdoing it. But yeah, something is going to break through. And in this case, it definitely did. And so after that, it was this long process of, you know, at first waiting for that moment to pass because you can't just be like, hey, I know you're going through like a horrible abuse situation, but want to talk to me again? That's just a very poor taste. And so then I ended up talking to her again a couple months later after the dust had settled some. And I was sort of like, okay, so what's happening here? Like, have you all separated? She was like, I've been advised by my lawyers not to talk about that. You know, I'm just trying to like make things in my own terms now, do things my way. And I was like, okay, cool. And then I think I can talk about this now a little bit more because in the book, I sort of have that series of events and a little line where I say that I spoke to her husband and he kind of okayed that whole, he basically said, yep, that happened. I did end up talking to him a fair amount more in a way where I couldn't really print it in the book, in part because he was like, yeah, this is off the record. When you're a journalist and someone says off the record, what that means is that they will give you information, but they do not want it printed with their name attached, or often printed at all. And in a case like this, where the only people who have the full story, where there are only two people who have the whole story, it's really hard to get around that. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to run this version of events and then sort of hopefully tell the fuller story down the line, which is that like, yeah, her husband was really shitty to her in that moment. The broader version is that, you know, they had been together for a long time and they sort of worked together to build the Amaranth empire, essentially. She did a lot of the work in front of the camera. He did a lot of business stuff. That's not to say she did no business stuff. That's just to say that like it was a collective effort. And I think that what I tried to say in that chapter, without being able to say everything, is that when you see someone on screen who's like a really big streamer or content creator, and it looks like there's just one person and they're doing it all, odds are that is not true. Odds are like they have someone, at least one person, if not many people behind them, because despite the fact that streaming and content creation seems like a more appealing job than like, sitting at a desk all day or doing construction, like it's still work and it's still a lot of work. It's multifaceted work and you need more than one person to handle a lot of that. So yeah, long-winded answer. There you go.
Not a good surprise. So I would assume that a lot of our audience members would be interested in becoming content providers. And since you have a lot of background, you've done research on it, what advice would you suggest for their success?
Let's see. Okay. Because it's really hard to like break in these days, again, because there's so many people doing this and who aspire to do this. There's like a survey some number of years ago of like the most desired careers now, and like content creator was number one out of everything that you could do in the world. I mean, again, I think that one of the most important things to do is to not start out trying to make it a career. I think that at this point, it's like, making music or whatever. Odds are you aren't going to turn it into a career, even if you're really good. Just like the right people probably won't find you because the internet is a giant mess of discoverability problems. So, if you want to do it to have fun. And then like, if you start to see something of an audience, then maybe get more serious with it. But until then, just, have a good time, stream or make content for your friends. Whatever else happens.
How do you approach investigative reporting, especially when dealing with sensitive topics? And you have touched on many of them.
Yeah, I mean, that's really difficult, depending on the sensitivity of the subject. So like, again, something involving abuse or harassment or whatever, like you've got to be very gentle with the people that you're talking to because they've gone through a traumatic experience. And so again, you can't like circle them like a vulture. I think that, there's some cases like in the aftermath of disasters or whatever, where you'll have like reporters show up on people's doors and they'll be like, "Hey, will you talk to us about like this and that, like what you went through?" And like that really puts people off, understandably, because someone just went through something. And so like where possible, give people time and room to deal with their problem before they talk to you is kind of what I've landed on. Just, when I reach out to people, especially people who've been through something, I often say like, take your time in responding to this if you want to respond at all. If not, I totally understand. That's fine. Like, you figure out your stuff. And then in the meantime, just try to sympathize as much as possible. Be like, yeah, I can't, I've never been where you are, but I can at least try to understand where you're coming from. And then, yeah, it's just a lot of things like that. Basically, the really short version is just treat people like they're people. I think that when you are someone who works in a field that involves a lot of talking to other people and trying to get things out of them, particular information or quotes or whatever to make your piece better, it can be easy to view them as just like objects or like, this is a goal to be achieved. I've got to like say and do the right things so that the correct outcome will occur. And like, A, that's sociopathic. And B, like it often doesn't work. So you just got to treat people like they're human beings. And if that leads to a good piece or a piece that exists, great. If it doesn't, then at least you were a decent person about it.
At Aftermath, you were working with former colleagues, and on your website, it states that you are trying to do something new for yourselves, it's actually ourselves, and for gaming journalism. Can you expand on that and possibly what trends you see that you, the bigger you, will be doing in shaping the future of video game journalism?
Yeah. So again, Aftermath is a new thing that me and a few like former coworkers at other places launched together a couple of years ago. And so it's fully worker owned, meaning there are no executives, there's no investors, there's no any of that. It's just us, which has been a fraught process on its own because we're not business people. And so every day we make some fun new mistake. But in short, like I think that the landscape of journalism in general is shifting tremendously. In a lot of ways, it's just eroding. I mean, if you look at major publications like the Washington Post, which I used to work at, or even the New York Times, the LA Times, so on, they are all having issues right now. The Post has been laying off people. The LA Times is laying people off. Pretty much any major publication you can think of is laying people off. Excuse me. In part because, or in large part because actually like content creation has sort of taken over in this regard. A lot of people, especially younger people, get their news from content creators. They don't go to publications like the Post or the Times or any of these. Like a lot of these publications are not relevant to them, both in terms of the way that they serve information, which is the written word, and also in terms of the way that they serve it. Like that they tend to, you know, toe various political parties' lines pretty hard and like not, I think, tell real or full stories. You know, they tend to be indebted to corporate backers. They tend to do all of these things that younger generations now find very off-putting. And so content creation has sort of stepped in and given a human face to a lot of this information and a human face that at least a lot of people feel like they can trust. And so I think that with Aftermath, what we're trying to do is bring a little bit of that back into our reporting. And then also just say like, okay, well, instead of dealing with executives or companies that will make bad decisions for us, because that often happens, like, you know, if not on the direct level of somebody who runs a company saying, hey, journalist, you can't report on this because it will endanger our relationship with whoever, then at least on the level of, okay, well, we have all of these good reporters who've been around forever. We're just going to get rid of them, though. And like, we're not going to replace them with someone who can do something similar. And so we wanted to we wanted to create a site where we can just report on the things that we find interesting and valuable without having to worry about that, without having to worry about being laid off. And, you know, where we can like call a spade. Because I think that another problem that journalism often has is like this idea of false neutrality, that you are telling a story that has two sides and you've got to convey both of them totally equally. And like, it's got to be neutral or objective or whatever. When the reality is, and I think content creation proves this, human beings are not capable of being objective. We've never been able to do that. We always kind of have some ingrained bias. And I think that you are better revealing that bias to an audience than pretending like it doesn't exist, because it will just manifest in other ways. For example, if you're writing an article that's meant to be like very journalistic, so you talk to people, you just describe the situation, you just say, here's the information, and then you're out. Even that, right? You still, as a human being, picked which quotes to feature, picked the order they will appear in, picked the other ancillary information that you include, even like, you know, statistics, all of that. You arranged all of it. And so, like, there's bias in every single step of that process. But so again, I think that a thing that we try to do is be like, yeah, this is where we're coming from. This is what we think. These are our political leanings. You know, if you disagree, you disagree, but at least you know.
So now that the book is published, what is your next project?
Man, what is my next project? I think probably focusing on Aftermath for a little bit. And then also, I recently had an idea to do a book that would basically expand on a lot of the content from the Hassan chapter of the Twitch book, which is like how content creation is affecting politics, how it's changing the way that, you know, political figures act and operate, both in terms of the way that people get information about what's happening in the world, and also just how politicians behave. I mean, like right now, one of the only candidate for like the mayor of Manhattan that I think is good, Zoran, is like all over social media. That's like how he's built his following. It's working for him. You know, I think that it's a kind of feedback loop of content creators coming up with ideas, politicians using those, and then content creators realizing, oh, politics gets me views. I'm going to do this. And it just becomes the circular thing. And then also just like on a larger level, I think one of the reasons that Trump did so well in the previous election is that he reached out to people like Aiden Ross and the Nelk Boys, both of whom suck, but it did views. Or even like, you know, he went on, he did an interview with Theo Von. Theo Von's a big name, former comedian, now YouTuber. It's hard to measure just how much that led to votes, because historically, content creators have not really like been able to generate that big of a groundswell movement in terms of people actually turning up at the ballot box. But like, I think that it did change perception of him. amongst like a certain demographic of people who watch these creators, which probably led to good outcomes for him down the line. And I think that everyone is sort of noticing that. And so I think it would be very interesting to try to measure a little bit more specifically where all of that is coming from and why it works now and why it didn't used to work and all that stuff. And then otherwise, I kind of want to write a book about a band that I like, but that's way more niche.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ready?
We'd love to take questions. We prioritize questions from students. I can bring the microphone over. If you are a student, please don't raise your hand timidly, raise it boldly, and we'll.
Let's go.
Hey, I just had a question regarding Aftermath and sort of how you went about advertising it back when you were starting it versus what advertisement methods you use now to sort of get the word out about it.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one in part because like with something like Aftermath or with anything that's like content online now, you never stop advertising. Everything is advertising now. So when we first launched, it was this like attempt at a media blitz using all of our like prior connections, which is something that if you are not already in the space, you can't do because you don't have those connections. But for us, it was like reaching out to every big name we knew or every even like relatively big name. And so like we had, an interview run on like The Verge, which is a tech publication that a lot of people read. Like we had, like Adam Conover and people like that tweet about us. We just made sure that we like for 1 week, we were just in everybody's faces. Like it was hard to escape hearing about us, which is like conventional wisdom of what you should do when you're launching something. Like advertisers will tell you, yeah, just do that. Because, people don't internalize things until like the 6th or 7th time that they've heard about it. So you've got to like make sure that you do all of those different times. And with the internet being so fragmented now, like you never know if you're going to get someone more than once. But now it's about, and this is the harder part, is like when you're running something that's subscription based, when that's your only source of income, then you've got to fight churn, meaning that just naturally due to, anything from somebody losing a job to just like them realizing they don't really like what you're doing anymore or whatever else, people will leave and they'll stop subscribing. And so you've got to bring in enough new subscribers to account for that. You've got to make the number go up slowly as opposed to down slowly. And so you've always got to be reminding people, hey, like, we need your money. And like not in the way that the New York Times wants your money, because they're a massive organization that makes millions. They're very profitable. They're paying executives. We're like 5 little guys, and we really need your help. And like conveying that constantly. And so I try to just like on any article that or any piece of content that does well, I'm like, hey, by the way, if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to Aftermath. Like we're worker owned, reader supported, and then I'll try to tie it back to whatever that piece was about. So like there was a piece that I wrote yesterday about Hassan Piker getting banned from Twitch for a day. And I was like, we very deliberately do not have executives so that we can avoid a situation where we get taken offline for, making somebody who's powerful angry. Those sorts of things. But yeah, it's an endless part of the job. If you launch something now, whether it is a YouTube channel or Twitch channel or a website, whatever else, you are now also a marketer, but they're not paying you for it. Congratulations.
Hi, Nathan. My name's Alex Carter. I'm from Riverhead, New York. My question to you is sort of about how Twitch has become mainstream recently. The success of Kai Cenat's Mafiathon 2, he broke the Twitch subscriber record. I think it was north of 750,000 subscribers, which is insane when you think about.
No one's ever going to break that. I mean, I'm wrong. It will happen eventually, but no one's ever going to break that.
So my question sort of with Kai Cenat sort of catapulting himself into the eye of pop culture through the Mafiathon and having celebrities like Kevin Hart and Drewski on his stream. We've seen Sketch, who's a NFL Madden guy, sort of go from the guy that plays Madden with his friend Zach Lewis to an NFL icon where the NFL is making social media posts using his quotes, him announcing a draft pick for the Texans. How do you see in the next 5 years Twitch sort of capitalize upon this mainstream momentum? And sort of, do you see anything with their business model changing because of that?
I mean, with Twitch in particular, we'll see, because they had a really big mainstream moment in 2020. And that was also their highest viewership ever in 2020 and 2021. And then they didn't do a great job of capitalizing on it. Like they had everything they needed to sort of enter, I think, a new echelon of kind of cultural awareness and just size in terms of overall audience. And they sort of flubbed it. in part because their goal right now internally is not to grow more. It is instead to become profitable. At least under Amazon, they have never been profitable. And so right now they're just trying to monetize everything they can. They're trying to squeeze more ads into the experience. They're trying to get streamers to do more deals with brands through them so they can take a cut. They are trying to, change the ratio of money that streamers make versus what Twitch makes off of subscriptions. All of these things, like that's where their focuses are aligned right now. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if Twitch will grow as a result of its mainstream popularity. I think that people like Kai will keep growing because Kai is huge. He's basically a mainstream celebrity now. But I think that in some ways, people like Kai have gone beyond the bounds of Twitch. Like in terms of overall viewership, obviously this isn't true, but like in terms of cultural impact, I think that Kai is bigger than Twitch. And like Twitch has also laid a ton of people off. A lot of people who, like had been with the company since the beginning, who are really smart, who understood it. It's not like the people who are still there don't care. It's just that they are spread very thin and like they're doing what they can to keep the lights on. I'm not sure if they have the capability right now to capitalize on this moment.
Can I ask 2 questions? Okay. So, earlier you had said your advice to aspiring journalists was to not be a journalist. And
I did say that.
I couldn't help but be reminded of the stigma surrounding journalism about like the validity of the job, whether or not it's like real work. People have that like misunderstanding around it, especially with something like video game journalism, if people don't consider that a real topic to even be a journalist about. But being that you're here, it must be a viable job in 2025. So what is the part of journalism that most people do not see that makes it a successful, viable career? Where does that misconception come from? And how do you like tell aspiring journalists how to go about it so that they don't fall into that trap of thinking it's not going anywhere?
Yeah. I mean, I think to begin, like, while it's an issue, especially now, journalism has never been especially popular among people, in part because like it involves again a lot of poking and prodding and invading people's space and asking them to tell you all of their or to tell you all of their secrets, but also because like good journalism speaks truth to power and challenges the status quo, and a lot of people who are powerful want the status quo to remain in place, and just people in general are made uncomfortable by the idea of the status quo changing or of change as just as a whole. And so like now you also have the compounded issue of journalism itself struggling to keep its head above water as a result of, again, content creation sort of moving in and taking its place, and also social media and social media companies taking the entire ad market away from journalism. So it's really hard for websites and publications to make money sustainably. And as a result of that, you have a lot of the remaining publications engaging in, very fast, kind of low effort content just to get stuff on the page and to try to get audiences to come to their sites. But a lot of that content does, like give off the impression that people didn't really try very hard to create it, which in some cases is true. That's not to say that the people involved didn't want to do something good. They were probably trying their best. But when you're working at a place, it's like, okay, we need like 2 or 3 pieces from you per day. You're not going to do your best work. You're going to, just churn out what you can and then go home and have dinner and go to bed. So I think that that's part of the reason why so many people now look at journalism and say, oh, it's not a real job, or these people aren't trying, or they're just like going on Reddit and taking what they see and reposting it elsewhere. As for what to do to avoid falling into that trap, like it's really hard because, again, in this day and age, there are so few journalism jobs, and a lot of the entry-level jobs are doing that kind of work, just like aggregating stuff from other places, posting it as quickly as possible, making sure that the site keeps moving. I've been very fortunate for one that I sort of entered the field at the right time. So like the bottom had not fully fallen out from it yet. There were still opportunities to, work at places where they would let you kind of do more in-depth work. And then beyond that, it's just been kind of, calling my own shots, basically. Like founding something like Aftermath, where I can do the exact kind of work that I want to. No one is telling me do something else or like post something that barely matters, just to make sure that the site feels vibrant. But not everyone has that opportunity. And I think that the hope with something like Aftermath is that eventually we will grow to be able to hire people and bring in new voices and not just rely on talent that's been there for years and years. But right now, again, it's a really uncertain moment. And so we'll see what the future holds for all of journalism as a field. But in the meantime, like, I don't think that journalists' reputations are going to improve. I think that they, for the reasons that I stated earlier, make for a very easy punching bag, especially when you are a content creator. A lot of content creators like to frame things as, you know, we're in opposition to the journalists, or we're in opposition to this particular publication. They're the bad guys. They're a faceless organization that's lying to you. I'm going to tell you the truth. And it's pretty easy to make things seem that way when it's at least partially true.
Okay, so I wanted to touch on the sort of the same aspect. Do you actually like your job, or is it kind of just inertia? If so,
Amazing question.
If so, what are your favorite parts of it?
Oh yeah, I love it. I mean, to still be doing this instead of like having moved on to, I don't know, working in PR and making way more money while not really giving a shit. You've got to be a total sicko for it. You've just got to be like a freak who really likes the job. I mean, the main thing that I enjoy is like having this excuse again to learn about all these new things and meet all these new people. And when you're first meeting someone normally, like in a regular situation out in the world, you can't just ask them to tell you like all of these really in-depth things or really specific things or like their secrets. There's not a good way to do that. Whereas if you're a journalist, you just say, I'm a journalist, let's go. And sometimes they'll even do it. It's also this thing where like it makes you view the world a little bit differently. Like in a lot of cases, even if you're not a reporter, you can message someone online and like ask them a question in good faith, and they'll probably just answer it. Like, I mean, if they're super famous, then probably not, because you know their DMs are fucking stuff. But if it's like an interesting person doing cool stuff, and you're just like, hey, I'm curious about that, you can just hit them up. Like, and I think that that realization opens a lot of doors, and like also just makes you view people a little bit differently. So yeah, I think that part. I really like waking up each day and being like, here's an interesting thought, or here's a question I have. And then by the end of the day, I've like answered it or talked to somebody who knows a lot about it. I'm like, that was cool. I'm going to do that again tomorrow.
That curiosity.
So I'm kind of curious, how did you get to this point, in your life where you have these connections and you get invited to all these events? And was this something like you grew up wanting to do, or was it just like something that happened?
Yeah, to answer the first or the second part first, I didn't grow up wanting to do this specifically. Like, I definitely knew that I wanted to write about games. I didn't envision it being a journalism type thing, or I thought it was going to be like writing reviews and, you know, criticism and things like that. But I sort of like backed into it in that at the time that I was coming up, a lot of places would hire freelancers specifically to do like quick news posts throughout the day. Again, like aggregating stuff. And so I was like, well, that's an easy way to be around this publication every single day, as opposed to like giving them a piece, you know, every couple of weeks where you're not really like part of the site, you're just sort of like orbiting it. And I figured, okay, well, I can parlay doing these news posts regularly into a more full-time job, or at least by, you know, everyone will get to know me. And so when they're hiring next, they'll want to hire me. And then that became a passion for the actual like reporting part of the job, because I realized that especially in games, there weren't that many people doing it. A lot of people who went into games journalism, and I think that this is still a problem to a degree, mainly do it because they want the access. They want to get games early. They want to eventually work for a video game company. And so they don't necessarily want to rock any boats. They just want to write things that are, if not favorable to companies, that at least like, again, they're just like, they're very soft touch. And for me, I was like, well, I know that I don't want to go work for any companies, so fuck it, I'll investigate them and make them all mad at me, which is really fun. But the way that you build up those contacts is really just by doing it, by spending a lot of time over the years talking to as many people as possible, especially ones who like know things and are maybe aligned with like your system of values. Because in a lot of cases, like again, as a journalist, you're going to piss people off. If you're doing the job right, you're going to make a lot of people mad. And that's not to say you should do it cavalierly. It's just to say that you should recognize that when you say something that is true, a lot of people who are powerful are going to get mad about that and try to bar you from accessing things from then on. But other people for whom you are hopefully speaking, people who are like actually doing the work and who care about what they're doing, will recognize what you're doing and appreciate it and, be willing to talk to you. That's sort of the trade that you make if you're doing proper journalism.
Check. 1, 2. Yeah, this question relates to diversity inclusion. So I heard been things lately about companies rolling back on diversity inclusion, especially in the gaming industry, like Sony, Microsoft, Activision Blizzard. But I found something kind of interesting about Nintendo. They're actually one of those few companies that are actually doubling down on diversity inclusion, plus because they're one of the few video game companies or even companies that support like gay marriage in Japan. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, good for Nintendo. Yeah, it's again, this is all interesting because, like I was saying earlier, I think that DEI for like what it was trying to accomplish on its face, like the name, like diversity, equity, inclusion. Good, we love that. The problem is that in a lot of scenarios, what it did in practice is it encouraged like sensitivity training and stuff like that, like these initiatives and companies that, at least in terms of longer term studies about them, kind of showed to not really have a big impact on the way people behaved. And in fact, in the case of sensitivity training, depending on how it's implemented, it would often actually increase racial bias, which is not good. And so like a lot of these major companies were just doing it because it made them look good or it like attracted some funding. So on one hand, definitely good that Nintendo, for example, supports gay marriage. Love that. On the other hand, is it like the end of the world that some of these companies are rolling back those initiatives? Not really, because I think what they actually needed to be doing and what they are hesitant to do and have always been hesitant to do is to elevate marginalized people into actual leadership positions, give them actual ability to influence the direction of the company and to have a say, have a seat at the table, as opposed to just being like, kind of paid lip service to, which is what a lot of, I think, DEI programs did, at least at major companies. I think the smaller companies probably operated more in good faith on that front, but don't cite me there. So yeah, I mean, we'll see what comes of all of this. I think that the short-term version is that a lot of these companies are kind of pre-surrendering to what they view as an ongoing regime in Donald Trump, and they're like, hey, look at us, be nice to us too, because Trump is pretty notoriously prone to picking on people he doesn't like and organizations he doesn't like and making sure that it's hard for them to make money. And companies just want to make money. That's all it is at the end of the day.
So I'm going to take 2 more questions. I confess that I'm biased in favor of gender diversity. If you feel that you have some way to contribute to the gender diversity of this conversation, I will be, I would ask you to raise your hand if you can.
Yeah, do it.
You spoke about the issues of stalking, and in particular, this concept of the viewers getting this sort of emotional attachment to those that they are viewing. And I've noticed with a lot of Twitch streamers, there's particular interactions that I think may add to that, such as monetizing, calling out, and essentially paying to be my best friend kind of aspect. And probably a little bit safer for male streamers than it is for female streamers to engage in that. But certainly as that becomes kind of a standard, I'm sure it's probably not beneficial to leave it out of your repertoire if you are a female streamer. What are your thoughts on that and how that could potentially be improved to be safer?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, like you're pretty on the money there. Like, I think that you see a lot more people react very strongly to this notion of, female streamers engaging directly with audiences than maybe they do with male streamers. Like one of the phenomena rather, is that instead of just a parasocial bond where it's like, oh, this person is my friend, something that people often talk about with female streamers is this idea of, oh, this person is like, in my head, they're going to date me, or like, they're going to get together with me, or like they are in love with me, even though I'm some random in their audience of like 1 million people. And so that's not great because it leads to these really strong reactions when that turns out not to be the case. You even have instances where like a lot of them actually, where female streamers, content creators, will hide their partners, will hide their like boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever, because they recognize that a portion of their audience, it's not that they're going to leave. This is like the predominant, I think, mode of thought on the internet is it's like, oh, I'm going to lose all my viewers, and like that's the reason I'm doing this. I think if you actually talk to any of the bigger like female streamers, they'll be like, no, I'm doing it to protect my partner. Because if people find out they have a partner, that partner will get harassed to hell and back. And so in a lot of cases, it's better just for people not to know. It's also like, you know, unless it is very relevant to what you're doing online, you have a right to privacy. Like you're broadcasting part of your life. You don't have to broadcast your whole life. As for how to make things safer, that's actually a challenge that, or that's a question that has been asked a lot this week. Again, following that stalking incident that I was talking about earlier, because there were kind of two modes of discourse around this. And one is that people said, okay, well, if you're a big name streamer and you're out in public, just hire security. What are you doing? You make millions of dollars, you know, have somebody tailing you, making sure that you're safe. Which, yeah, if you make millions, go for it. You should do that. But most streamers cannot afford that because security is expensive. And so then it becomes a question of the culture. And right now, I think a lot of the culture is animated in this way that, you know, very much treats women like, at least among like younger men, treats women as like they owe you something, and if they don't give it to you, then you know you should be able to tell them off or even attack them or whatever, which is really, really messed up. And there are all of these streamers and content creators who don't necessarily like state that in plain terms, but they propagate the mentalities that would lead somebody to ultimately believe that or think that's an okay thing to do. I mean, like literally what we saw with, you know, the incident earlier this week that involved Valkyrie and some other streamers like that, is that the person tried to get a streamer's number, was rebuffed, and then literally tried to physically attack her. Like these things are intertwined. I know this happens a lot out in the world regularly. Somebody gets catcalled, or somebody calls somebody. A woman is like, "Don't do that," and they're like, "Well, fuck you then." Like, you know, they immediately get angry. We can't have that be the way that women are treated, or the way that all these content creators are now telling young men that it's okay to treat women. Like until that changes, or like that's the main thing that needs to change. Like security is a last line of defense. Certainly it can help, but like more generally, we just need to, and this is really hard to do because American society especially has been hating women for as long as it's been around, but we kind of got to cut that out. It's the short version. Not easy to do. And like we'll definitely, I think, take a lot of change on the part of not just creators, but the platforms that they're on. And I think that a lot of those creators and platforms are not willing to change, and they're not incentivized to do it right now because they can make money this way. But like that's what will actually be required to sort of turn this ship around.
If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, you'll have that opportunity on the signing line. If you have a long, complicated question, be mindful of the people who are standing behind you.
But also, I love to give long, complicated answers. So.
But I will take one final question. Yeah. Well, actually, this gentleman raised his hand earlier. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. So, in your experience with content creation journalism and streaming journalism, what do you have to say about the VTubing section of content creation and streaming?
Wait, can you say that again? Sorry, I didn't catch the end there.
What do you have to say for like the VTubing section of like content creation and live streamings? Because they're very different than the traditional live streaming.
Yeah, VTubers are fascinating. I mean, I think that for the most part, it's a really cool segment of kind of the entire content creation sphere. Like Iron Mouse is one of my favorite creators at this point. But it's also really interesting in that, so for those who don't know what a VTuber is, it's basically somebody who, instead of having themselves on screen when they're playing a game or whatever, they have like a digital animated avatar, often one that looks like an anime character. Sometimes they're based more on like video game characters. It depends on what someone's going for. It's usually like an original character, though, of their own design, or they hired an artist to make. And so with that comes a layer of sort of anonymity, in that like you are not on screen. You can pretend to be a character if you want to be, which I think is, you know, we were talking about kind of the way that women are perceived in these spaces. And that is one way to take a step back from audience scrutiny. Because like another thing that happens to female streamers all the time is that everyone in chat is like just talking about their appearance or being like, you're ugly, or being like, oh, people are only here because, you know, they want to look at your boobs or whatever. And if you have this digital avatar kind of standing in for you, there's a little bit less of that. You can just open up and be yourself a little bit more. But also VTubing is like, its history comes from idol culture in Japan. That's where it sort of got started. And there's this like long lineage of companies controlling both idols and VTubers. And so that's a little bit fraught because basically in Japan, there's this one major company called HoloLive, for example. And so they own the IP rights to all of these VTubers. And so even though you have a person who's doing the work, the output of their work, they don't actually own. And so they can be like graduated at any time, which basically means that like that character is retired, taken off the lineup. And functionally, whoever did all that work does not have a job anymore and doesn't have any rights to all of the work that they did. They don't, you know, the VODs aren't theirs, the rest of it isn't theirs. And so like on one hand, it allows in some cases creators to be a little bit more free. On the other hand, VTubing can be a mechanism of control in a way that you just don't get if you're somebody who's on camera being yourself, because, you know, it's not like a company owns your likeness rights unless you sold those away, which you shouldn't. And so, yeah, it's like a really interesting segment. I think that it's good that there are a lot of independent VTubers now, especially in the West. I think that that sort of picked up more, whereas in Japan, a lot of them are still owned by companies. But yeah, I don't know, it's cool. I mean, earlier this year or last year, Iron Mouse briefly held the record for most subscriptions on Twitch. That's why Kai actually went and did Mafiathon 2 in order to beat her record, which, you know, they're both chill about it. But yeah, VTuber briefly was the most subscribed streamer on the entire platform. So they're big and getting bigger.
A rich, in-person conversation with a flesh and blood human being, Nathan Grayson.
I'm actually a VTuber. Sorry, just to be clear, not real.
And
Hey.
Carol Ann Germain.